You have a major publishing project now, doing a children's version of the Big Al-Ghazali opus. Yeah, thank you. So tell me about that project and what you hope will come of it.
Right, Fons Vitae is devoted to world spirituality and the dignity of the human spirit in all traditions, and having people come to find a way to not just tolerate one another, but to admire and learn deeply from. And it's always been for adults. And then recently, the idea of what do we do about the wonderful children in the entire Islamic world who are often getting a literalist education and a view of their faith, which is not its true status. What will happen to them if they are given a fundamentalist approach to their faith? Not only will they not love and enjoy their faith, but then they will feel excluding others. They won't respect other traditions either. And so a group of us had the idea, what if we took the writings, the opus magnum of Imam al-Ghazali, who lived to be only like 54 years old. He lived from 1158 to 1111, and he was the greatest Islamic scholar of the world at that time, and he basically knew it all, and he had a spiritual crisis. His autobiography is fascinating. I've done a co-publishing with Harvard of it. And he basically realized that for all his greatness, he was full of pride, and he was a hypocrite because he was teaching humility. And one day he walked out and he became a janitor in Damascus. And for 10 years, he realized that in the 400 years Islam had been functioning, it had gone from being a spiritual effort to one of literalism. So he spent those years and he started from what is knowledge up till death and re-explained how every dimension of the Islamic faith is for spiritual nourishment and reformation. So we thought the Ghazali has always, all these centuries, existed in Arabic and Persian. Muslims love him, but they can't read him, it's too hard. And the few translations of some of those volumes in English are for scholars. So the project is, we're having these translated by scholars into normative English that you or I or a teacher could read, or a mother or father. And then these are being reworked as stories for children with workbooks and, website and all the rest.
Ken, you're currently an author-illustrator of children's books. Could you briefly describe how you got into that work and why you think it's important work?
Yeah, well, I've always been a creative person. I've always loved music more than anything, but I have no ability with music at all. Mm-hmm. And so when I was a teenager, my brothers and sisters, my parents would tell me to quit playing my guitar, quit playing the piano, but they were fine if I sat in my room with earphones on and just and drew while I listened to music. So that's how I got into art, and I've always loved story. I've read a lot. So those two things combined, and they've never left. And I've been always making stories and illustrating them over the years. And eventually, I just realized I really need to. I just need to do this full time. So that was how I got into it. I think children's books are really important because, for the obvious reasons that they're for children, and we want kids to, we want to teach them everything we know, how to be good people. But I think they're also especially important, especially picture books, because they're read over and over by adults. So it's a shared experience. Mm-hmm. It's like a little home theater where the kids and the parents are enjoying a play together because there's images and words. So I think those two things together make it just a really important thing in character development and in just the relationship of the reader and the kid that's listening to it.
Both of you approach children through stories. And First Ken and then Gray, why do you think stories are so helpful to children as they try to make sense of the world?
So yeah, why are stories important for kids? I think stories just have a unique power in articulating truths. Because I mean, they somehow percolate into our brains in a different way than just presenting someone with a fact, something like that. So I think stories for kids, in my experience, they just grab onto them in such a ready way. It's easy, and they get it, and I think that's it. The form of the story, however you call it, the story itself it just has a little magic to it that kids respond to right away.
And the same for us. I mean, all of the world's faith traditions are based on story narratives.
Right,
I mean, Joseph Campbell said, don't ask if the story is true, ask what is the truth it's expressing. So it doesn't even matter whether Job was historically true, but that story teaches you patience. And if someone just said to you, be patient, it's a virtue, and you didn't hear what he went through and his inner dignity and all the things that happened, you wouldn't get it. You know, we're trying right now with the children's stories to make them act them out. So it's not just they're told something, but then they reenact and they start to experience it, not as just a concept, but as something they are feeling, you know? So, I mean, stories are the whole thing.
Yeah.
Tell me your story. You know?
And then they reference, so if you know the story of Job, then it's a reference point. So you can just say, like old Job, and instantly, for whoever knows the story, that whole story is open to them.
That's really true. I mean, this morning at breakfast, I said, tell me your story.
Right.
Yeah, there it was.
Yeah, it's a way of knowing each other.
Yeah, now we love each other. We got it together.
What are some of the things that you hope children can learn from the stories that you're involved in telling or publishing? We might start with you, Gray. What are some of the particular things, and feel free to give some examples as well.
The importance of the story in this particular effort we're making is really to first give children a knowledge that their true self, that they're two selves, that there is the higher real self. You could call it the Christ nature, the Buddha nature, whatever you want. And then you have the lower egoic nature, which thinks of itself first. It's not the one that shares. It's the one that it's for me. And when children can learn of these two and realize that their true self is not the lower one. For example, I have a granddaughter, Sophia, and she took her little sister's toys. And so I said, Sophia, did you know you had two selves? And she went like this. I said, yes, your real luminous self, and then the not real self that like takes toys and doesn't help mother. I said, who took your sister's toys? And she drew herself up and she said, not my real self. Then you have them, because when you criticize them, you're not criticizing them. Together you're looking at the self that everyone is supposed to be dealing with. And you know about that because you've got a conscience, which is like the agent of the higher self. So you immediately give them the tools of being able to identify with something that is already pure. The innate nobility of spirit is not a matter of you've got to somehow get there or be that way. That's impossible. You're already there. Just be who you are, you know? So that's the starting point. And then Ghazali presents the metaphor of polishing the heart. The real heart, the golden heart, the real you, gets dust on it. So like, if you brag or if you don't share, you get dust on your heart. Well, why would you want to polish that off? Well, then you explain, oh, didn't you know there are two worlds? This world we're in we're all promised three losses. Loss of what we expected, loss finally of health, and finally lives. And this life is brief, and it's full of suffering and difficulty. You find this in Buddhism, right? But then there is another dimension, whatever you'd like to call heaven, kingdom of heaven within. and everything will be fine then. So already children are always afraid of death. You know, if they see a dead fish, a dead dog, oh gosh. But what happens is, no, they're not, that's not a concern, but they realize it's important to polish your heart. So you start to give them the tools by which they can experience a dignity and have a real reason not to brag, not to be angry, to share. And then, of course, all the stories and metaphors which Ghazali present, and they're fantastic stories and images, teach them that they can trust, that they can do the right thing, and that it's fun, and that every moment of their life is an opportunity to purify. Say you're an Iraqi child and your whole house has been blown away and your parents are dead. You can hate us for that, or you could say, my goodness, here is an opportunity for me to polish my heart through detachment and perseverance and patience.
Yeah, so when I write my books, I don't write with a specific lesson in mind. I start with a story, like an image or a premise, sometimes a whole plot that comes to me. But then I pursue that and just try to tell the best story I can. Mm-hmm. And I trust that sort of what's inside of me, the good self, comes out, and I'm guided by this quote that G.K. Chesterton, I found of G.K. Chesterton's, and he says, we need so to view the world as to combine an idea of wonder and an idea of welcome. So those two ideas, wonder and welcome, are what hopefully guide the inside of me as I'm just working on getting a story that's really compelling.
Welcome like what? The child feels welcome? What do you mean by welcome?
Yeah, it's a little ambiguous. I mean, one concrete example is for the American market, which is who I write for, is to include children, people of color in it, because there still isn't enough representation of them.
Yes.
And so when I visit schools, I often notice that if there's one child of color in the back, or if the whole room is full of children of color, I just feel like it's important for them to know that when I'm writing and when authors are writing, we're talking about you too. So that's the most concrete example.
Inclusive.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
And awe, give us an example of how you do wonder.
The easiest one is in my illustrations. I try to always incorporate horticulture, foliage. I try to have lots of foliage, and even if it's a fairly urban scene, I try to have a pretty naturalistic touches at least, because that's where I experience wonder the most, is in nature. So I try to put that in my books too. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Give us one example of an Al-Ghazali story that you find that you think will have real resonance with children.
Ghazali speaks of the story of the ant and the pen. And there's an ant on a piece of paper, and it sees writing. And it can see the nib of the pen and the pen. Maybe it can see the hand and the arm. Maybe it can see me, you see. But the ant has thought the pen is writing. And this way I changed the story. Because Ghazali is always speaking in terms of the macro, the ultimate, the guidance we have from the divine, and you're given your life. You and I didn't give ourselves our skills, our energy, our place in time and space. These are there for us to serve with, So I had the story in which some little ants, their parents said, we're going to the zoo. And they were very excited. And then they said later, sorry, we're not going to the zoo because the relatives are coming. And the little ants do what all of our children do. But you said we were going to the zoo, and moping, know. And so then the relatives come, the children are probably not happy. Then at the end of the day, they hear on the ant radio that a tiger has gotten out at the zoo today. And it was a terrible ravage and scene at the zoo. And the parents said to the children, do you see God in his wisdom, his omniscience, sent the relatives so that we didn't go to the zoo? Now, that is so when disappointment comes or it doesn't work out or you don't get to the birthday party, instead of being like children are, you know, disappointed, a bad mood, they can suspend, that they can trust. And the other day, I live on the Ohio River, Louisville, and my husband has a boat, a motorboat. He's a duck person. And my 2 grandchildren and my son and his wife have just moved to Louisville, and they drive down the Ohio River every day, but no one's ever been out. And the grandchildren are little, like 4 and 6. So the big day came for the boat ride, much preparation, and my grandson got a high fever and we had to cancel. Much disappointment. And then it turns out, and I went to see him lying in bed, you know, that day the Ohio had risen and all kinds of brushwood was coming and it was rising over the docks and there was a terrible current. So I said, look at this, you know, you got the fever so that our lives weren't endangered. So he got it. Do you see what I mean? That was the first lesson. You know, and even when, for example, his sister is making these horrible sounds when I'm driving around, I said, would the golden heart make that sound? You know, so we always have a reference point with the heart. So that's just one little story, but it's one.
In all human cultures, the default setting when they're confronted with someone from a different culture is ethnocentrism. To think one's own culture is better or superior, does things correctly, and the other culture does not. So can stories, do they have the potential to prepare children for a more open response when they first come into contact with someone from a different culture, a more open response that is not the default ethnocentric response?
Yeah, I think stories can definitely open up our minds because stories, what stories do is they take us to another place. They introduce us to new people and take us to another setting. And I think that stories help us to accept each other in the same way that traveling does, because it's kind of another kind of traveling where you're moving in your imagination to another place and you're hearing other people's thoughts, and I think that just almost always inclines us towards sympathy and empathy.
I'm trying to do that in 2 ways, with the illustrations and with the characters. The illustrations for the Book of Knowledge and the Book of Belief, and all of them, are children from every different country and culture. And I have Mauritanian children who live in the desert. You know, I have from every culture. And then, for example, when I have someone with a golden heart and the face is brightened, you know, I have African children, you know, all the world. And then there's a hero in the 3rd book, because the children are kind of depressed. They're walking through the town, and they admit that they really don't want to tell their parents that really they don't want to say their 5 prayers a day or whatever they're supposed to be doing, but they can't tell their parents or their grandparents. They'll get some kind of pious thing. So they're talking, and they find a forgotten garden. You see, the garden, that's a great metaphor. And find a secret, you've got to have secret mystery place. And they're sitting there and they think, but who could answer our questions? So they say, what about, there's that wonderful old man who's always sitting in the park and the birds are around him, sort of a St. Francis character. He's Hajj Abdullah. He's made the pilgrimage, Abd Allah, and he is a servant of God. That's his name. So the name. And of course he is, I've made him dark-skinned, the elder, the wise man of the town. And they go and he agrees to come to the garden. And he is really, what I have the elder being, he's someone who is explaining their faith to them through Ghazali. He's teaching them Ghazali. But then I've decided to have him through the books, even in the same book, in the workbooks, I change his appearance because I want him to be every man, not one character, but I have him sometimes this way, maybe Iraqi looking, sometimes African, many things, so that it can be your grandfather, it can be your teacher at school, it can be an elder. So those are some of the ways I'm addressing that, but maybe it needs to be addressed also head on in terms of in the stories really talk about, isn't it? Have you ever been excluded? Oh, it's horrible. Let's play exclusion. How does this feel? Let's exclude you. Okay. How does that feel? And you know, we're trying to do that with workbook activities to act out how awful these things are. And I mean, children are pretty cool, and they're not coming to us with that. I taught filmmaking at a school called Dalton in New York, and they were hip kids, very hip, you know, like Jules Pfeiffer's children, and of all colors. And one day we were doing a film about the fake world we're in the real world. And they set up, it looked like, they made a pretend setting of a subway car with their parents just going to work, not speaking, then drinking. And then they said to one guy, Darren, African American, now when you approach us, we're going to turn away from you, because that's what's going on, isn't it, man? So you've got a lot to build on, because kids don't come that way. And more to build on today than we had growing up. So I think these stories can really help that too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Religion can sometimes reinforce the ethnocentric response in this particular way. We usually believe, and we teach our children to believe, that the tenets of a religion are true. And therefore that, at the very least, implies, and usually teaches, that other religions have things wrong. So here's my question. Can we tell stories that help children to both believe that their religion is true, and yet also to embrace with openness children who believe a different religion is true? Can we help them navigate that tension between those two really important values?
You want to take that one first?
All right. What I'm thinking to do on this subject specifically, because for example, in Islam, the Quran says, God speaking is the royal we. We have sent to all peoples at all times religion in their language. In other words, in their culture. And if we had wanted to make all people of one faith, we could have done that. We made you different so that you may know one another and respect one another. Plenty of Muslims don't think that way, but that's actually in their book. But what I thought would be good to do is to use the image of white light as truth. And it comes through the prism. We can say time and space is like a prism, and it breaks into hues like the rainbow. So it's light, it's the same light, but it's coming through in the lavender hue, and speak about the beauty of the different hues. You know, this is a good challenge you're bringing up, you know, to really get that one figured out and clear.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think my tendency is to always shoot for the common denominator of religions. So if I was explaining it to my son, I think I would try to say, I would try to go for the wonder and delight that we as Christians experience with God, and then just say, and I think those people, whoever we're talking about, I think they experience that too. And at least for his age, just kind of leave it at that. So it's like, oh, these people experience the same thing, and so instead of it being, instead of emphasizing the difference, you're emphasizing the similarity. And when he's older, he can figure more of it out. We can talk more in depth.
The great prophets and messengers who have come to all the world's traditions, they have been people who were humble and served. They were not people characterized. Can you imagine Jesus bragging or gossiping? Any of those things that we're dealing with the children, you know, the virtues. So what I've done, for example, this past Christmas, when my little grandchildren are suddenly overwhelmed by thousands of presents and Santa Claus and the whole scene, I just said, all right, do you know what's going on here? Why this is such a big deal? This is a birthday. And we are celebrating Christ's birthday. And why is it being done at this scale? Why are all these presents? Because he had a perfect golden heart. He was utterly pure. He never did any of these things. He was there humbly serving and caring for everyone with complete love. He didn't judge people. And I said that every day during the Christmas holidays because I didn't want that lost, you know? And I carried it through on Easter as well. Because what's going on is that they have to understand that these great beings, you know, I'm trying, for example, to imitate the nature of Christ. The Muslims, it's the Sunnah, the imitation of the Prophet Muhammad. And we were talking earlier, he's lived in Uganda, I've lived in Cairo. And the kind of generosity we've seen in the third world, we can't touch it here. You walk across a field and there's a poor peasant who has one chicken. He joyfully cooks it and with joy has you eat it. You're in England and they have a chicken and they can barely give you a transparent slice, trembling. You know, no one says, here, eat the chicken. And you know, if you make homemade chocolate chip cookies and guests come, you probably serve them the store-bought and eat the rest yourself. Not there. With joy, they give the whole chocolate chip and you start thinking, what's going on here? Are they better people? No, they're simply imitating the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad because if even anyone says, you know, that's beautiful what you're wearing, you know, the person usually just says, here, take it, if you love it that much. And they're copying a model. So what we have to do is provide that model to children that it's worth copying. And Ghazali makes a huge deal that we are all teachers. And you can tell the children, you're a teacher too. You know, would you want what you just did copied? You know, because we are copying each other all the time. Oh, she did it that way, she's wearing this. She does her eye makeup that way. You know, everybody's copying. So do you want to be copied? And then there are all these stories about the good teacher, which can be you as a child. The ants and the whales ask God's blessing for you. And the angels stroke you with their wings. You know, the nice images. And I had the little girls like, oh, I'd like the angels to stroke me with their wings. That would be nice. You know, I'd like the whales. So in a way, we're trying to find ways that are common to all the traditions because each of these great beings exemplified universal principles. What we're talking about is universality. You know, these things are hardly. The Christian artist who was doing the children's book about the virtues and vices, she said, I wish I had had this book in Sunday school because mine were spread out all over the place. This way it's just like, it's over, you can't ever gossip again, it's finished. And the children, oh, it's finished, you know? So anyway, I think we go to the universal beauty of these great beings, of the saints and sages of our various faith traditions.